He was only 10 years old, sitting quietly in a corner where he'd learned not to be seen. Around him stood power, wealth, and pride, men who believed money could solve anything. Then came the laughter, a billionaire's cruel challenge, a locked safe, and a promise so reckless it stunned the room. What no one noticed was the child they had already decided didn't matter. In less than a minute, silence would replace arrogance, and a truth about racism would be exposed in the most unexpected way. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow, we've got something extra special for you. Before the crisis that would shake everything, life moved in a quiet, predictable rhythm for Malachi Dillon. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with a habit of observing the world more than speaking to it. His days were divided between school, books borrowed from the local library, and the narrow apartment he shared with his mother. It was not a life filled with comfort or ease, but it was steady, and for Malachi, stability mattered more than anything. Paige Dillon woke every weekday before sunrise. For nearly a decade, her alarm had rung at the same hour, pulling her from sleep into another long day of work. She cleaned homes that were never hers, wiped fingerprints off surfaces she would never own, and moved through other people's wealth as quietly as possible. She believed in staying unnoticed, in not giving anyone a reason to complain, in surviving. That belief shaped the way she raised her son. Malachi understood early that the world treated some people differently. He saw it in the way teachers lowered their expectations, in the way store clerks watched him too closely, in the way his mother spoke softly in places where others raised their voices freely. Paige never explained racism with long speeches. She didn't need to. She taught him through rules meant to keep him safe. Stay quiet. Stay respectful. Don't draw attention. Be invisible. School was the one place where Malachi felt slightly less small, not because it was easy, but because his mind worked differently. Numbers stayed with him. Patterns locked themselves into his memory without effort. Pages he read once came back to him word for word. Teachers noticed, but their schools were crowded, underfunded, and stretched thin. Talent without opportunity was something they saw too often. Malachi learned quickly that being gifted didn't mean being protected. When spring break arrived, routine broke apart. Paige's work did not stop just because school closed. Bills didn't pause. Rent didn't wait. With no childcare available and no one else to turn to, she brought Malachi with her to work. She told herself it was temporary, just a few days. She reminded him again and again of the rules. Sit quietly, touch nothing, stay out of sight. The estate they traveled to each morning sat far from their apartment, behind tall gates and manicured lawns that seemed to stretch forever. It was a place built on control, every hedge trimmed perfectly, every camera positioned with purpose. Inside the mansion, everything gleamed. Marble floors reflected crystal lights. The air smelled polished, expensive, and distant from reality. This was the world of Wells Stevenson. Stevenson's home ran like a machine. Staff moved in practiced patterns, careful not to disrupt anything. Paige blended into that system easily. She had learned how to become part of the background. Malachi followed her, backpack clutched close, eyes wide but cautious. He noticed everything: the layout of the halls, the sound of doors closing, the way adults spoke differently when power was nearby. It did not take long for tension to appear. Malachi's presence disrupted the illusion of order. A child did not belong in this world of strict boundaries and unspoken hierarchies. Paige felt it in the air, the shift in energy, the tightening of rules that had never been written down. She worked harder, faster, trying to erase her son's existence through effort alone. What Malachi did not yet understand was that this house was built on more than wealth. It was built on contempt, on the belief that some people were naturally meant to command, while others were meant to serve quietly. That belief would soon find a target. Days passed and something began forming beneath the surface. Not loud, not obvious, just a growing pressure, a collision waiting for the right moment. Inside the mansion, a powerful man guarded his secrets obsessively. Inside a quiet child, details were being stored, remembered, and preserved without intention. Nothing had gone wrong yet, but everything was already in motion. And long before anyone realized it, the path toward humiliation, injustice, and an impossible challenge had already been set. As the days continued, Malachi learned the unspoken geography of the mansion, the places where he was allowed to exist and the places where he was not. Corners were safest. Doorways were dangerous. Silence was protection. He sat with his books, his back straight, his movements careful, as if taking up too much space might trigger something unseen. Around him, adults passed without acknowledgement, their conversations floating above his head as if he were part of the furniture. Paige watched constantly. Every sound made her tense. Every approaching footstep forced a quick scan of the room to make sure Malachi was where he should be. She cleaned faster than ever, polishing already spotless surfaces, folding towels that didn't need folding, doing anything to prove she was useful, compliant, grateful. Experience had taught her that gratitude was expected, even when dignity was not offered. Malachi noticed how his mother's shoulders stayed tight inside the house, how her voice softened even more than usual. At home, she laughed sometimes. Here, laughter did not exist. This place demanded obedience, not humanity. Still, Malachi tried to make sense of it all the way children do, by observing, remembering, quietly adapting. He noticed the routines. The same doors opened at the same times. The same people crossed the same hallways. He noticed patterns in conversations, in habits, in behavior. Some people spoke freely. Others waited to be spoken to. Some were addressed by name. Others were addressed by function. Cleaner, driver, staff. Invisible roles in a visible world. What Malachi did not yet know was that the man who owned the mansion believed deeply in order, his order. Control was not just a preference, it was a necessity. Everything in the house existed to reinforce that belief. The cameras, the locks, the rules, and most of all, the boundaries between who mattered and who did not. That belief surfaced in small ways at first. A dismissive glance, a careless remark spoken just loudly enough to sting, a reminder that some people were guests only because they were useful. Paige absorbed these moments silently, the way she always had. She lowered her eyes. She apologized even when she hadn't done anything wrong. Survival had taught her that resistance came at a cost she could not afford. For Malachi, these moments were confusing. He had done nothing. He followed every rule. Yet he could feel disapproval settling on him like a shadow. He didn't yet have words for racism, but he understood rejection. He understood being unwelcome. He understood that his presence alone was somehow a problem. Still, life continued. Days turned into evenings. Cleaning schedules were completed. The mansion returned each night to its perfect stillness. And during those evenings, when the house grew quieter, Malachi's observations deepened. Without meaning to, he began noticing things most adults overlooked. The way certain objects were handled with care. The way some rooms were treated as untouchable. The way one door, heavier than the rest, was approached with something close to reverence. He did not ask questions. Asking questions had never been encouraged. Instead, he watched. His mind worked the way it always did, collecting details, storing them without judgment. At school, this made him gifted. Here, it simply made him silent. Paige sensed that something was wrong, though she couldn't name it. She felt the pressure building, the way tension thickened the air day by day. She told herself they only needed to make it through the week, just a few more days. Then life would return to normal. She didn't know that normal had already been interrupted. Because elsewhere in the mansion, something else was happening. A man who trusted nothing, and no one was beginning to lose control of the one thing he valued most. Frustration crept in. Anger followed. The kind of anger that looks for a target when it has nowhere else to go. Malachi and his mother were still just trying to get through each day, still invisible, still careful, still unaware that they were standing at the edge of a moment that would expose everything this house was built on. The tension had not exploded yet, but it was tightening quietly, relentlessly. And when it finally did, it would pull a child out of the shadows and force the world to look at what it had chosen not to see. The shift did not happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine, wrapped in power and entitlement. By the fourth day, the mansion no longer felt merely unwelcoming. It felt hostile. The kind of place where every movement was watched, every mistake magnified, and every silence misunderstood. Wells Stevenson had noticed the boy. At first, it was just irritation, a disruption in his perfectly ordered world, a child where no child should be. Wells prided himself on precision, on control, on a household that functioned like a well-oiled machine. And machines did not have children sitting in corners with backpacks and books. Machines did not have unpredictability. Malachi felt the change before he fully understood it. He felt it in the way conversation stopped when Wells entered a room, in the way Paige's hand shook slightly as she cleaned, in the way the air seemed heavier whenever the man's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, teaching you to hold your breath. Wells began to make comments, not shouted, not dramatic, just sharp enough to cut, words spoken under his breath but loud enough to be heard, comments about boundaries, about people knowing their place, about how some children grew up with the wrong expectations. Each remark landed like a small blow, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to listen for it. Paige responded the only way she knew how, by apologizing, by working harder, by shrinking herself further. She reminded Malachi again and again to stay quiet, to stay close, to not look around too much. She feared that any attention, even accidental, could cost her the job she depended on to survive. But Malachi's silence did not protect him. It only made him easier to ignore. The injustice escalated. One afternoon, Wells walked into a staff area and stopped abruptly when he saw Malachi reading. The boy didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the page just as he'd been taught. Wells stared for a moment too long. Then came the laugh, sharp, dismissive, the kind that made the room feel smaller. That laugh echoed in Malachi's head long after Wells walked away. Later that same day, Paige found Malachi sitting unusually still, his book untouched. She asked what was wrong. He shook his head. He didn't know how to explain the feeling of being judged for existing. He only knew that something inside him felt heavy, like a warning he couldn't name. Meanwhile, Wells was unraveling in ways no one else could see. For days, he had been struggling with something deeply personal and deeply dangerous, his locked safe. The one thing he trusted more than people, the place where he kept not just money but control, documents, power, proof. And now, for reasons he could not understand, it would not open. Each failed attempt sharpened his mood. Frustration became anger. Anger turned into cruelty. And cruelty, as it often does, looked for an easy target. The mansion became a pressure cooker. Specialists arrived and left. Equipment filled the study. Hours passed with no progress. Wells drank more, slept less. His temper grew unpredictable. Staff avoided him when they could. Paige moved like a ghost, desperate not to be noticed. Malachi watched everything. He watched the experts spin the dials. He watched Wells pace the room, his confidence cracking with every failure. He watched the way grown men with expensive tools couldn't solve a problem they didn't fully understand. And quietly, without realizing the weight of it, Malachi's mind began connecting pieces. Then came the offer. It happened suddenly, explosively. Wells, exhausted and furious, stood in the center of his study surrounded by people who had failed him. His voice was loud, unsteady, fueled by desperation. He declared the challenge without thinking through the consequences. He put a number on the table so large it silenced the room. $200 million. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Everyone froze. The technicians exchanged looks. The staff stiffened. No one spoke. No one moved. It was the kind of moment where something irreversible had just been said, even if no one yet understood how. And in the corner of the room, nearly forgotten, sat Malachi. He had been there all along, watching, remembering. His heart began to race, not from greed but from recognition. The sound of the dials, the rhythm, the sequence. His mind replayed an image he had stored days earlier, crystal clear and unchanging. He knew something no one else did. But knowing and speaking were two very different things. The room did not feel safe. Wells did not feel safe. History had taught Malachi that raising his voice in spaces like this led to consequences. He remembered every look, every comment, every reminder that he did not belong. Fear pressed down on him, urging him to stay silent. The tension tightened. The experts went back to work with renewed urgency. Time passed. Nothing changed. The safe remained locked. Wells grew more volatile. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Malachi felt trapped between two truths. One, that he could help, and two, that helping might make everything worse. Paige sensed the shift. She noticed Malachi's distraction, his clenched fists, his silence deepening into something heavier. She wanted to ask what was wrong but feared drawing attention. Fear makes even love cautious. As the hours passed, the offer remained on the table, witnessed, real. The number echoed in Malachi's head, not as money, but as a symbol of everything unfair about the world around him. So much wealth, thrown away in anger, while his mother worked herself into exhaustion just to survive. The injustice burned quietly. Then came the moment. Malachi stood up. The movement was small, almost unnoticed, but in that room filled with tension and failure, it felt enormous. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Wells looked up, irritation flashing across his face as he registered who had spoken. The boy's voice was soft, almost uncertain. But the silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, the balance of power began to shift, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The reaction was immediate, though no one spoke. Attention moved like a spotlight, slow and unforgiving, landing on Malachi where he stood. For a child who had been trained to disappear, the weight of that attention was almost unbearable. His chest tightened. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Every instinct screamed that he had made a mistake. Wells saw him fully now, not as background, not as an inconvenience, but as a disruption. The irritation on his face hardened into something colder. In that moment, the imbalance of power became painfully clear. A billionaire surrounded by professionals. A child standing alone. The room itself seemed to lean toward Wells, waiting to see how he would respond. Malachi hesitated. Fear rose like a wall in front of him. He remembered the rules his mother had taught him. Silence keeps you safe. Invisibility keeps you alive. Speaking up had never been part of survival, yet something deeper pushed against that fear. A sense of certainty. A quiet knowing that would not leave him alone. Behind him, Paige felt it before she saw it, that tightening in her stomach, that familiar dread. She turned and spotted her son standing where he shouldn't be, exposed in the open. Panic surged through her. She wanted to pull him back, to shield him, to undo the moment before it could become something dangerous, but fear rooted her in place. The injustice of the room thickened. Around them, the specialists watched with mixed reactions, some with disbelief, some with discomfort, some with curiosity they did not want to admit. None of them intervened. Silence became complicity. It always did. Wells' frustration needed an outlet. The safe had humiliated him. His power had been challenged. And now, in front of witnesses, a child had stepped forward, one he had already dismissed as insignificant. The situation offended him. His authority felt threatened, not by skill or status, but by audacity. Malachi felt the pressure bearing down on him, but his mind remained clear. The images were still there. The numbers, the rotations, perfect and unchanging. They existed independent of fear, untouched by intimidation. Knowledge, once gained, could not be erased. The specialists waited. Wells waited. The house itself seemed to pause. Time stretched in uncomfortable ways. Seconds felt heavier than minutes. Malachi's legs trembled, but he did not step back. Something had shifted inside him, not confidence, something quieter. Resolve. Page's fear transformed into something else entirely. Beneath the terror was a lifetime of swallowed anger, years of being spoken down to, of being ignored, of teaching her son to survive in a world that demanded his silence. She saw now what that survival had cost him, and she realized that whatever happened next, the moment could not be taken back. Wells moved closer. His presence dominated the space. Power has a way of reshaping rooms, of making others feel smaller simply by existing. Malachi felt it, but he also felt something new, a strange calm, as if everything leading up to this point had been preparing him for exactly this. The challenge still hung in the air, the promise, the money, the arrogance behind it. Wells had expected professionals to answer him, not a child, especially not this child. The injustice was no longer subtle. It was exposed, raw and unmistakable. A system where some voices were instantly dismissed, regardless of truth or ability. A system where worth was assigned long before effort could be proven. The specialists shifted uneasily. They understood the implication. If the boy was wrong, the humiliation would be public and brutal. If he was right, everything would change. Malachi took another step forward. That movement broke the tension like a crack in glass. The room could not return to what it had been. The challenge was no longer theoretical. It had become personal. Paige felt her breath catch. She had spent her life teaching her son how to endure injustice quietly. Now he was standing in the center of it. She feared retaliation. She feared consequences she could not control. But she also felt a spark of pride she had never allowed herself to feel in places like this. Wells' expression darkened. Control was slipping and he could sense it. The room was watching him now, measuring his response. His authority demanded dominance, but his desperation demanded a solution. Those two instincts collided violently inside him. The specialists stopped working entirely. Their machines hummed idly. All eyes were on Wells and the child he had underestimated. The offer he had made in anger had created a moment he could no longer escape. Malachi stood still, his small figure steady against the weight of the room. The knowledge remained clear in his mind, untouched by fear or doubt. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And in that charged silence, as power, prejudice, and desperation collided, the story moved toward a point of no return, one decision away from exposing everything this house, and the man who owned it truly stood for. No one stopped him. That fact alone revealed more than any words could. In a room full of adults, experts, and authority, a child stood exposed, and no system moved to protect him. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, as if everyone understood that something dangerous was unfolding but chose comfort over conscience. Wells broke the stillness with a sound that resembled a laugh, though it carried no humor. It was sharp, dismissive, edged with disbelief. The kind of sound meant to put someone back in their place. The kind of sound Malachi had heard before, even if never this close, never this loud. The injustice crystallized in that moment. Malachi felt it like a physical force, but he did not retreat. His mind stayed fixed, anchored by certainty. Fear was still there, pulsing beneath his ribs, but it no longer controlled him. Something stronger had taken hold, the understanding that staying silent would change nothing. That silence had never protected his mother. It had never protected him. It had only taught others that they could act without consequence. Wells' gaze bore down on him, heavy with power and expectation. The man was used to obedience, used to rooms bending to his will, used to people shrinking, and here stood a child who refused to disappear. Around them, the specialists felt the tension escalate. They had come to solve a technical problem, but now they were witnessing something far more uncomfortable, a social truth laid bare. Some looked away, others watched intently. None intervened. Paige's heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it. Every instinct told her to step forward, to pull her son back, to apologize, to erase him from the moment. But another instinct, long buried beneath years of endurance, held her still. She realized that whatever came next would define something far bigger than this room. The house felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. Power does that when it's threatened. It tightens, compresses, lashes out. Wells' desperation seeped through his arrogance. The safe remained closed. His empire was cracking. Deals were collapsing. Reputation was slipping. And here stood a solution he refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it would mean confronting his own prejudice. That refusal became its own kind of violence. Malachi waited. Seconds stretched. The silence became unbearable. Wells' jaw tightened. His authority demanded he shut the moment down. His survival demanded he listen. The two forces collided inside him, and the conflict showed on his face. The injustice sharpened with every heartbeat. This was no longer just about a safe. It was about who was allowed to be capable, who was allowed to speak, who was believed without proof, and who was dismissed no matter the truth. Malachi's calm unsettled the room. He was not pleading, not begging. He was simply there, present, steady, unafraid to exist in a space that had never made room for him. That quiet confidence was more threatening than any outburst could have been. The specialists shifted again. One of them glanced at the safe. Another checked the time. Everyone understood the stakes. Wells' offer had been made publicly, witnessed, real. If the child succeeded, the consequences would be irreversible. Paige held her breath. She thought of every morning she'd woken before dawn, every rule she'd taught her son about surviving a world stacked against him. She realized now that survival had limits, that dignity demanded moments like this, even when they came at a cost. Wells finally spoke again, his voice edged with irritation and disbelief. The tone was meant to dismiss, to belittle, to remind the room who held power. But the room had changed. His words no longer landed the way they once did. The challenge stood. The injustice stood. And Malachi, the child who had been invisible for so long, stood at the center of it all, carrying knowledge that could shatter a man's control and expose the truth beneath his wealth. The rising action tightened its grip. Because once the first step is taken, there is no going back. And the next moment, whatever it would be, was about to push this story past fear, past silence, and straight toward an unavoidable reckoning. Wells took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the child. The movement was deliberate, meant to reassert dominance, to remind everyone in the room who controlled the outcome. His shadow fell across Malachi, long and heavy, and for a moment it felt as if the entire house leaned with him. Malachi did not move. That stillness unsettled Wells more than any protest could have. He was accustomed to reactions, fear, apologies, retreat. Stillness meant resistance. Quiet resistance was harder to crush because it offered nothing obvious to strike. The specialists watched closely now. The problem they had been hired to solve was no longer technical. It was human, and humans made unpredictable choices when pride and desperation collided. The tension in the room reached a level where even the hum of machines felt intrusive. Wells' frustration surged. His mind raced through collapsing deals, unanswered calls, the growing sense that he was losing control of everything he had built. The safe loomed behind him, a silent monument to his arrogance. He could feel its presence even without looking at it. Locked, unforgiving, unmoved. Malachi's heart hammered, but his thoughts remained clear. The sequence replayed again in his mind, flawless and precise. The numbers were not guesses, they were not theory, they were memory, solid, permanent. Knowledge does not shake when fear rises, it simply waits. Paige felt time slipping through her fingers. Every second Malachi remained visible increased the risk. She imagined consequences she could not protect him from: loss of her job, retaliation, blame. In places like this, accountability rarely traveled upward. It fell on those with the least power. The injustice sharpened with that realization. Wells glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the audience. 12 professionals, staff members hovering at the edges. Too many witnesses to pretend this moment never happened. His offer had been reckless, but it was real. His authority demanded he shut this down. His survival demanded he take any chance he could get. He hesitated. That hesitation spoke volumes. Power, when absolute, never hesitates. Wells' pause exposed doubt, and doubt, once seen, spreads quickly. The room sensed it, the specialists sensed it, Paige sensed it. Malachi felt it too, like a shift in the air before a storm. The child took a slow breath. It was a small act, but it grounded him. Fear receded just enough for resolve to take its place. He had spent his life being told to stay invisible, to avoid moments like this. Yet here he was, standing at the center of one that could not be avoided. Wells' expression hardened. The choice was closing in on him. Either he dismissed the boy and accepted defeat, or he allowed him to try and risk humiliation far greater than failure. Pride screamed at him to refuse. Desperation whispered that he had no better option. The injustice lay in that choice alone. That a child's worth was being weighed not by truth, but by a man's ego. The specialists waited, their tools idle. Time pressed in from all sides. Business deadlines, legal threats, reputation slipping through Wells' fingers like sand. Every second the safe stayed closed made his situation worse. Paige clenched her hands, nails biting into her palms. She silently begged for this moment to pass without destroying everything they had worked for. She also knew, deep down, that some moments are meant to break things open, no matter the cost. Malachi stood firm. The room felt charged now, electric with anticipation and dread. Something irreversible hovered just ahead, a decision that would define who was believed and who was dismissed, who held power and who was allowed to challenge it. Wells finally turned toward the safe, then back toward Malachi. The movement was slow, measured, as if he were forcing himself to confront something he had avoided his entire life. Not the safe, not the money, but the possibility that he had been wrong about people. The rising action tightened to its breaking point. Because once Wells made his decision, there would be no undoing what followed. The challenge would either expose a child to humiliation or expose a powerful man to the truth he had spent years denying. And the room waited, breath held, on the edge of a moment that would change everything. The room no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, a battlefield without weapons. Every sound had faded except the quiet hum of machines and the shallow rhythm of breathing. Wells Stevenson stood still, staring at the child in front of him, as if refusing to acknowledge him might make him disappear again. But Malachi did not disappear. For the first time since stepping into that mansion, the rules had shifted. Silence no longer protected the powerful. Authority no longer felt absolute. Something fragile and dangerous had entered the space: truth. Wells turned slowly, scanning the room. 12 professionals, witnesses, proof of his desperation written all over the scattered tools and sleepless faces. His offer still sat on the desk, signed, dated, undeniable. $200 million promised in a moment of rage. He could feel the weight of it now, pressing against his pride. And then he looked back at Malachi. The injustice sharpened in his eyes, not loud, not explosive, but unmistakable, a belief hardened by years of power that this child did not belong here, did not deserve attention, did not deserve a voice. That belief battled violently with the reality in front of him. Malachi felt the tension crackle in the air. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but he did not retreat. His heart raced, not with excitement, but with the awareness that this moment could break him or change everything. He thought of his mother, of her long mornings and quiet suffering, of the way she taught him to survive, not to shine. He thought of every time he had swallowed words to stay safe, and he realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. If he stayed silent now, the injustice would win forever. Wells spoke at last. His voice was low, edged with disbelief and irritation, as if the words themselves offended him. The tone carried authority, but also something else, fear. The fear of being wrong. The fear of losing control in front of people he believed he was superior to. The specialists watched closely. No one interrupted. No one dared. Paige felt her knees weaken. She wanted to scream, to pull her son away, to shield him from whatever came next, but she also saw something in Malachi's posture that she had never seen before. Not rebellion, not arrogance, clarity. Wells gestured toward the safe. That single motion changed everything. The massive steel structure loomed behind him, silent and unforgiving. It had defeated experts. It had humiliated its owner, and now it stood as the final barrier between arrogance and truth. Malachi took a step forward. The sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoed louder than it should have. Every eye followed him. Every breath caught. The room seemed to shrink around his small frame as he approached the object that had broken a billionaire. He stopped inches from the safe. Up close it was immense, cold, impenetrable, designed to exclude everyone except one man, a monument to mistrust, a symbol of power hoarded and protected at all costs. Malachi felt the fear surge again. This was no longer theoretical, no longer internal. This was real, public, irreversible. Behind him, Paige closed her eyes. Wells crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, part challenge, part mockery, part desperation. The injustice in the moment burned so brightly it felt unbearable, a child forced to prove his worth under the gaze of a man who had never questioned his own. Malachi lifted his hand. It hovered over the dial. Time stretched. The specialists leaned forward. Phones buzzed silently in pockets. Somewhere outside, the world continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But inside that room, history waited. Malachi placed his fingers on the metal dial. It was colder than he expected. His mind cleared. The fear receded just enough. The sequence appeared again, sharp and perfect, not as hope, not as guesswork, as memory. He began to turn the dial. The first rotation was slow and deliberate. The room held its breath. The second rotation followed. Wells stiffened. The third. A faint sound echoed from inside the safe. Not an opening, just a whisper of movement, enough to change the air completely. The specialists exchanged glances. Paige opened her eyes. Malachi continued. Every turn of the dial felt heavier than the last. Every second stretched tighter. Wells' confidence cracked visibly now, his jaw tightening, his posture rigid. This was no longer entertainment. This was danger. The dial turned again. A sound came from deep inside the safe. Clearer this time. Unmistakable. The room froze. Because for the first time in 6 days, the impossible no longer felt impossible. And Wells Stevenson realized, far too late, that whatever happened next, he was no longer in control. The sound echoed again, soft, mechanical, unmistakably real. It wasn't the dramatic crash Wells had imagined if the safe ever failed. It was quieter than that, more terrifying, a sound that suggested precision, knowledge, control in the hands of someone he had never believed capable of it. Malachi's fingers stayed steady on the dial. The room no longer breathed. Wells felt something cold slide down his spine. This was not coincidence, not luck, not a trick. The movements were too deliberate, too exact. The child was not guessing. He was remembering, and that realization struck Wells harder than any insult ever could. The specialists leaned closer, forgetting their roles, their neutrality, their distance. One of them swallowed hard. Another glanced at Wells, then back at the safe. Years of training told them what their eyes were seeing. This sequence was right. Malachi turned the dial again. Another internal shift. Another quiet response from deep within the steel. Paige pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, not from joy, not yet, but from terror. This was the moment she had always feared. The moment when her son stood exposed before power, before cruelty, before consequences she could not shield him from. Wells took a half step forward, then stopped himself. His instincts screamed to intervene, to halt the process, to reclaim authority. But it was too late. He had already invited this moment into existence. He had spoken the challenge out loud, signed it, witnessed it. The injustice had crossed a line where it could no longer hide. Malachi's mind was calm now, eerily so. Fear still existed, but it had moved to the edges. At the center was only focus. The numbers unfolded exactly as they had the night he first saw them, not as symbols, as motion, as rhythm. His hands followed memory the way water follows a path already carved. Another turn. The dial clicked, different this time. Sharper. Final. The sound cut through the room like a blade. One of the specialists whispered something under his breath. Another took an unconscious step backward. Wells felt his stomach drop as the meaning registered. This was it. Malachi reached for the handle. Time fractured. In that frozen instant, Wells saw everything he had built begin to tilt. The safe was more than steel, it was proof. Of power, of superiority, of a world where he decided who mattered. If that door opened, it wouldn't just expose money and documents. It would expose him. Malachi pulled. At first, nothing happened. A breath of relief surged through Wells', chest so fast it almost hurt. Then the mechanism released. A deep, resonant sound rolled through the room as the internal locks disengaged. The kind of sound no one forgets once they hear it. Final. Absolute. The door swung open. Silence collapsed into chaos. The safe stood exposed, wide, undeniable, open. For a split second, no one moved. Then reality hit. Wells staggered backward as if struck, his face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His fortress, his perfect, impenetrable creation, had been undone by a child he had spent days dismissing. The specialists stared, stunned, some in disbelief, some in awe, some in quiet horror at what this moment meant. Phones appeared in hands almost instinctively, recording not just the open safe, but the expression on Wells' face as his world cracked apart. Paige collapsed into a chair. Her knees gave out, her body trembling as the weight of the moment finally hit her. Pride crashed into fear. Relief tangled with dread. Her son had done the impossible, but in a world like this, impossible achievements did not always bring safety. Malachi stood frozen, his hand still on the handle. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, breathing, as if unsure whether he was allowed to exist in this moment. The injustice now stood naked. Not subtle, not disguised. A room full of adults had failed where a child had succeeded. A man with limitless resources had been undone by arrogance. A system that dismissed brilliance based on skin and status had been publicly exposed. Wells found his voice at last. It came out hoarse, broken, stripped of authority. He stared at the open safe. Then at Malachi as if seeing him for the first time. Not as background, not as a problem, but as a force he could no longer control. The signed offer lay forgotten on the desk. The money inside the safe, once a symbol of dominance, now felt like evidence. Malachi turned slowly, looking toward his mother. Their eyes met. In that look past years of sacrifice, silence, endurance, and love, no words were needed. Everything they had survived had led here. But the room was far from finished with them. Because power, once exposed, does not surrender quietly. And as Wells took another step forward, his face hardening, his pride bleeding, the question was no longer whether the safe could be opened, but what price the truth would demand next. The room changed the moment Wells stepped forward. Not with noise, not with movement, but with intention. The open safe stood behind Malachi like an exposed wound, steel peeled back, secrets laid bare, documents stacked neatly inside, bundles of cash, folders marked with names that carried weight far beyond that room, proof of wealth, proof of power, proof of a life built on control. Wells' face tightened as he took it all in. For years, that safe had made him untouchable. Now it made him vulnerable. He looked at Malachi again, and this time the look was different. Not disbelief, not shock, something far more dangerous: calculation. The injustice had reached its most honest form. Wells straightened his jacket, as if restoring order to himself might restore order to the world. His voice, when it came, was quieter, but sharper, controlled. The kind of tone that had ended careers and ruined lives without leaving fingerprints. The specialist sensed it instantly. A few shifted uncomfortably. One glanced toward the door. Another lowered his phone, suddenly unsure whether recording this moment was wise. Paige stood, forcing her legs to steady. Every protective instinct she had roared to life. This was the moment she had feared more than failure. Success had made her son visible, and visibility in places like this came with consequences. Malachi felt it too. The triumph faded, replaced by a familiar tightness in his chest. He had done what no one else could, but he was still a child standing in a room owned by a man who hated being exposed. Knowledge had opened the safe, but it had not dismantled the power structures surrounding it. Wells gestured vaguely toward the open door of the safe, as if acknowledging a technicality rather than a truth. His eyes never left Malachi. The offer, the promise, the witnesses. Everything hung in the balance. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Wells might back down, as if the weight of the room, the evidence, the undeniable reality of what had just happened might force him to accept the outcome. Then his pride surged. Power does not like being embarrassed, especially not publicly, especially not by someone it has already decided is beneath it. Wells spoke again, and the room leaned in. Paige felt her breath catch. This was it, the moment that would decide whether this story became one of justice or one of punishment disguised as procedure. Malachi stood still, his posture calm but alert. He had crossed the line already. Whatever happened next would not be undone by silence. He understood that now. He understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in an unjust world is prove you were right. The specialists exchanged looks. The offer had been made clearly, the condition fulfilled undeniably. They had seen the safe closed for days. They had seen it open under the child's hands. They were witnesses to history, whether they wanted to be or not. Wells' gaze flicked to them, sharp and warning. The room felt like it was shrinking again, not from fear, but from truth pressing in on all sides. Walls built on arrogance always feel smaller when they start to crack. Paige stepped closer to her son, standing beside him now, no longer hiding. For the first time in years, she did not lower her eyes. Whatever happened, she would face it openly. The injustice had reached its breaking point. This was no longer about money, or a safe, or a challenge spoken in anger. It was about whether a system would acknowledge brilliance when it came from a place it had learned to ignore, whether truth could survive contact with power, whether a child who had spent his life being invisible would finally be seen, not as a problem but as proof. Wells inhaled slowly. The room waited. Outside, the world continued, unaware that inside this mansion, something fundamental was being decided. A precedent, a reckoning, a line drawn between arrogance and accountability. And as Wells opened his mouth to speak again, one thing became painfully clear. The safe was open. The truth was out. But the real test, the one that would reveal who truly held power, was only just beginning. The room did not erupt the way moments like this do in movies. There was no applause, no celebration, no instant justice. Instead, there was something far heavier: reckoning. The open safe stood silently behind Malachi, its contents exposed to the air for the first time. Money lay stacked in perfect order. Documents rested where they had always been, waiting. Power, once hidden behind steel, now sat in plain sight. And yet, for the first time, it looked fragile. Wells Stevenson did not move for a long time. When he finally did, the confidence that once defined him was gone. What remained was a man forced to confront something he had spent his life avoiding: the truth that his authority had limits, and that his certainty about people had been wrong. The specialists began to pack their equipment slowly, quietly. No one spoke much. There was an unspoken understanding that this moment would follow them long after they left the mansion. They had not just witnessed a technical impossibility undone. They had witnessed a system fail, and a child succeed where power had refused to look. Paige stood with her hand resting lightly on Malachi's shoulder. Her body was still tense, but her grip was steady. She had spent years shrinking herself to survive, years teaching her son how to disappear so the world wouldn't hurt him. Now, standing in that room, she realized how heavy that lesson had been. Necessary, yes, but costly. Malachi did not feel victorious. What he felt was relief mixed with exhaustion, the kind that settles in after holding fear inside for too long. He had not opened the safe to prove anything. He had done it because he knew he could, because silence had finally become heavier than risk. Wells' offer, written, signed, witnessed, could not be undone. Lawyers would argue details later. Money would move. Consequences would follow. But in that moment, something more important had already happened. The illusion of superiority had been shattered publicly, and illusions, once broken, do not repair easily. News of what happened did not stay inside the mansion. Stories like this never do. They travel, they spread. They make people uncomfortable, and discomfort is often the first step toward truth. For Paige and Malachi, life did not suddenly become easy. There was no instant transformation into comfort or safety, but something fundamental had changed. Malachi had learned that his mind mattered, that brilliance did not need permission to exist, and Paige had learned that protecting her son did not always mean keeping him invisible. It sometimes meant standing beside him when the world finally noticed. That night they returned home to the same small apartment, the same worn furniture, the same familiar silence, but neither of them was the same person who had left that morning. Malachi lay awake long after the lights went out, staring at the ceiling. The numbers still replayed in his mind, but now they carried a different meaning. They were no longer just a secret. They were proof that the world's expectations were not the same as its limits. Paige sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. She thought about all the moments she had stayed quiet to survive, and she wondered how many children, just like her son, were carrying gifts the world had already decided not to see. What happened in that mansion was not an ending. It was a beginning. Because while one safe had been opened, countless others remained locked, built not of steel, but of prejudice, fear, and assumption. And opening those would take far more than courage from one child. It would take a world willing to look. The days that followed unfolded more quietly than anyone expected. There were no headlines splashed across television screens, No viral clips replayed on a loop. Power rarely announces its embarrassment. Instead, it retreats, regroups, and tries to regain control in subtler ways. But silence did not mean nothing had changed. Within professional circles, word spread carefully, almost cautiously. Deals were questioned. Trust wavered. People who had once praised Wells Stevenson's brilliance now spoke in measured tones, re-examining the man behind the image. Reputation, once fractured, does not heal easily, especially when its foundation is arrogance. Wells himself withdrew. Meetings were postponed. Appearances canceled. Those closest to him noticed a shift, though few understood its cause. The fortress he had built around himself no longer felt secure. The safe was open, but so were the doubts. And doubts are far more dangerous to power than any lock ever could be. For Paige, the aftermath was more immediate and more personal. Returning to work was no longer an option, not because she was fired and not because she quit, but because the unspoken rules had changed. That house, once a place of quiet endurance, now carried too much weight, too many memories, too much truth. It was frightening at first. Losing certainty always is, but something unexpected happened in the uncertainty. Paige found strength where fear used to live. She no longer measured her worth by how invisible she could become. Her son had shown her that survival was not the same as living. Malachi returned to school when break ended. The building looked the same. The desks were the same. The teachers were the same, but Malachi was different, not louder, not arrogant, simply steadier. He raised his hand more often, asked questions without apologizing for them. His teachers noticed the shift, and this time they listened. Programs were found. Opportunities slowly appeared. Not miracles, just chances. The kind so many children never receive because no one stops long enough to look. Malachi did not become extraordinary overnight. He had always been extraordinary. The difference was that someone had finally paid attention. And that is where the story reaches beyond one family. What happened in that mansion was not rare. It was simply visible. Every day in offices, classrooms, hospitals, and courtrooms, brilliance is overlooked because it comes from the wrong place, because it wears the wrong skin, because it speaks too softly or not at all. Racism does not always shout. Often it whispers. It lives in lowered expectations, in dismissive glances, in assumptions made without evidence. It lives in the belief that intelligence, worth, and potential belong naturally to some, and must be proven relentlessly by others. Malachi's story challenges that belief. Not because he was exceptional, but because he was never given the benefit of being ordinary. He was never assumed capable. He had to demonstrate perfection in a moment where others were allowed failure after failure. And that is the injustice. The world often demands excellence from those it refuses to respect, while granting grace to those it already trusts. It builds systems that reward confidence over competence, familiarity over truth. Paige understood this now in a deeper way. She saw how many parents carried the same quiet fear she once did, the fear of their children being seen too clearly, or not at all. The fear of teaching them to survive in a world that would not protect them. This story is not about a safe. It is about who we believe. It is about who we listen to. It is about the countless moments when someone speaks up, only to be ignored because the room has already decided who matters. And it is about the cost of that ignorance. Because brilliance does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, waiting, not for permission but for the chance to be seen. He made it home that night, but not unchanged. Malachi lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his neighborhood, a distant car passing, a door closing down the hall, the hum of a city that never fully sleeps. These were the same sounds he had known his whole life, yet they felt different now. Not safer, not easier, just clearer. He understood something that many never do, that the world often decides your worth long before you speak. And that sometimes, The most dangerous thing you can do is prove those assumptions wrong. Paige sat beside him until he fell asleep, her hand resting gently on his arm. For years, she had taught her son how to stay invisible. That lesson had kept him alive. But now she knew invisibility was not the future she wanted for him. The world had already taken enough from him. It would not take his voice too. Life did not transform overnight. There were no fairy tale endings, no sudden wealth that erased struggle. They still lived in the same apartment. Paige still woke early. Bills still arrived on time, whether money did or not. But dignity had entered their lives in a way it never had before, and dignity changes everything. Wells Stevenson faded from public view, not dramatically, not loudly, just slowly, the way power often does when it is forced to confront its own reflection. The open safe had not ruined him. What ruined him was exposure. Once people saw the truth, once they saw how easily arrogance could mistake itself for intelligence, nothing felt solid anymore. But this story was never really about him. It was about a child who had been taught to shrink in order to survive. A mother who swallowed her pride to protect him. A system that confused silence for weakness and prejudice for order. It was about how many Malachis exist right now, brilliant, capable, unseen, sitting in classrooms where no one expects much from them, walking into buildings where they are watched more closely than welcomed, learning, far too early, that excellence is often demanded from them just to be treated as equal. And it was about us. Because injustice does not survive on cruelty alone, it survives on indifference, on moments when we choose not to notice, not to listen, not to believe. The safe opened that day, but it wasn't the most important thing that unlocked. What unlocked was a truth we too often avoid. That talent is everywhere. That brilliance does not belong to one color, one class, or one voice. And that the cost of ignoring it is paid not just by those we dismiss, but by all of us. So the question remains, how many voices are we still ignoring? How many children are still being told, without words, to stay invisible? And how many futures are we locking away, because we refuse to look beyond our assumptions? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, reflect on it. And the next time you see someone overlooked, underestimated, or unheard, pause. Because sometimes, the person the world dismisses is the one holding the key. And the moment we choose to listen, everything can change.